This week, Koom interviews Rob Walton, who created the graphic novel Ragmop in the 1990s and is now releasing a sequel. How does one approach continuing a series based on the mores and political situation of the 1990s in the present day? First, I'd like to thank our patrons for keeping this show going. Join them at patreon.com/deconcomics. If Patreon isn't in your budget, you can also send a one-time donation of any amount via PayPal to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
This is Koom for Deconstructing Comics, and I'm in Toronto with
Rob Walton.
Yes, and Rob is in the process of releasing his second volume of Ragmop.
That is correct. The first volume came out in 2006. I had a very long layoff. I committed myself to working in animation as a storyboard artist for the last 10 years, but then when I was working 2 years ago, in late 2016, I was working on Max and Ruby, and I was just not getting any laughs, and I needed laughs in my life, and I decided it was time to go back to do Ragmop and do a new Ragmop because basically I needed the laughs.
Okay. We should talk a little bit about what Ragmop is about, and I only read your first volume, which I think you told me was about 60% finished through a couple of different companies, and then after a hiatus, you finished it on your own and self-published it?
Yes, it began as a self-published comic book through Planet Lucy Press.
Is that like your own?
That was my own imprint.
Yeah.
And it ran in the 1990s from June of 1994 to sometime in 1998. The last issue came out. And in between, there were 2 issues published by Image Comics when Jim Valentino did a black and white line very briefly. And Bone was part of that. And I forget who else was part of that. I think Xander Cannon was also part of that. And myself as well. And I got through 2 issues, but the sales did not justify continuing for Image. So I did one kind of concluding issue on my own, my infamous all black and white issue.
So they were just taking too much of a cut for you to justify?
It's not that they were taking too much of a cut. It's just that, I needed sales of about 5,000 to make it financially viable for Image to recoup their costs.
Oh.
Of the catalog plus the printing. They really didn't. I don't remember them taking much of a cut of the actual profits. I think that was the whole point.
Did they promote it well?
Oh yes, they promoted it very well, and I have all that promotion still in my little binder there. I still have a Ragmop clip binder. And I have all those original Diamond Preview ads that they did, or that I did, and provided for.
It seems like you got a lot of good press from around that time, because I see all the quotes, and I remember seeing it around, and I did buy a couple of issues back in the day. Although it's a really hard story to understand unless you follow it from beginning to end, I feel.
Well, yes, it is. It is a graphic novel. And when I was doing it in the 1990s, yes, it was very well received critically. If people had negative notices, they didn't tell me. And I didn't see anything in print. But when I was doing it as a black and white bi-monthly comic, I was kind of doing it off the top of my head. I did have a general plot in mind, but I was very undisciplined. If I had an idea, I kind of went with it, and it was kind of tangential. I kept going off left, I kept going off right, and then having to bring myself back onto the narrative.
Sure. What did you intend to do with the plot back then?
Well, what I intended to do with the plot was what actually ended up in the graphic novel. Really, on the very last issue that I published, I did at the end, on the last page, publish a kind of a little paragraph on how the story ends. And when I finished the graphic novel, I did reference that. Some things changed because it was 10 years later or 8 years later, but not a lot changed.
So if we could encapsulate for our listeners what that first run of Ragmop is about, should I take a stab at it? Because I'd be curious how my appraisal of it maybe ranks with what you wanted to do.
Well, yeah, and let me just open up a couple, because what I did on Twitter last year or in 2017 was it's easier for me to speak through my characters, so I let them describe how it was. So I can also open up a couple of JPEGs here and let the characters speak for themselves.
Sure.
So you take your stab first.
Okay, before we read what your characters say?
Yeah.
Okay, so for me, like stylistically, it's got a lot of influences from like I noticed the Reservoir Dogs reference from like back in the 90s to like cartoons to pinups, but like it seems to be a smorgasbord of you commenting on the world order and how capitalism and democracy have kind of come together to fuse an agenda that's very much about kind of controlling the way people kind of go about their lives in a very kind of, I don't know, unspirited kind of way because of this hegemonic kind of organization that's kind of ruling the planet. And towards the end, it becomes this kind of cosmic reckoning with your own version of what the entity is that's kind of keeping everything going. And it's sort of a mixture of mythology, religion, quantum physics. It's just got all this stuff thrown in. So it's hard for me to kind of unify it in some description, and I haven't even started talking about the specific characters
or the specific plot. Yeah, I mean that's very true. And just to kind of continue on your thought there, and that's an excellent encapsulation of kind of the ambiance of what's underlying that. And the one thing you didn't mention is that it's funny.
Yeah, it's very much got
it's told as a Warner Brothers cartoon.
Yeah.
And that's
with some comics things thrown in as well. But the comics things are references, whereas the Warner Brothers cartoon is more its style and its rhythm.
Yeah.
And like you say, the particular kind of funny it is.
Yeah, and
boing.
Yeah, and it certainly is a distillation of all the pop culture that I absorbed as a child growing up in the 1960s and 1970s. I mean, Bob Clampett is a major influence on it, which is where the title Ragmop comes from, which was from, I got it from Beanie and Cecil.
And maybe you should explain what that is, because I'd never heard of Ragmop.
Yeah, Ragmop is a nonsense song that was very popular with the big bands in the 1950s. And it was a type of song that they could have the audience join in, and it's just a chance for the band members to just have fun. And you can actually go on YouTube, and there's some really wonderful YouTube videos from that period, from the 1950s, of some bands performing Ragmop, and they're just having the time of their lives.
Sure.
And that's what I wanted. I wanted a title like Yummy Fur or like Peep Show or like Palookaville, that is a general title under which many subjects could be done. But also one that was reflective of animation and reflective of anarchy. And certainly Ragmop was that, because nobody kind of embodied cartoon anarchy like Bob Clampett. And if you look over there, you can see my Bob Clampett there. There's Beanie and Cecil with the Wild Man of Wildsville.
Sure.
Yeah, so nobody epitomized cartoon anarchy like Bob Clampett. If you watch his cartoons from the 1940s, and even Beanie and Cecil, he just doesn't care. He doesn't care about television or about the studios. He's just doing whatever the heck he wants. And so that's where that's why it was the kind of the perfect title.
Sure. A couple of questions. Do you think people got the title? And then my bigger question is, since you're so influenced by animation, why make a comic instead of making that kind of cartoon?
Okay, well, first question, did people get the title? Yes, back in the 1990s, people got the title. Everybody knew Ragmop.
Ah,
You know, as soon as they saw as soon as they saw Ragmop, it was Raggmop, Ragmop.
I see.
And people started singing along. But to your second point, which was why not just make a cartoon,
Yeah.
is because, well,
So much more labor?
well, I would have to sell it to a studio,
Sure,
and
sure.
and even though, and so that's why.
Gotcha.
It's an impossible sell. As a matter of fact, after the graphic novel came out, I was approached by a Toronto studio to develop it as a series, and I wrote a pilot script. I wrote the Bible. I did a lot of work. And they ended up passing on it
I'm
because
sorry to hear that because your style is so iconically lovely.
yeah.
Like it's very polished and
Well, maybe it was just 10 years ahead of its time as far as television goes. Maybe now,
sure.
and one of the things I wanted to do with the new graphic novel is I wanted it to be presented as a cartoon. Whereas this one kind of goes through various different styles. Sometimes it's serious, sometimes it's really cartoony, sometimes, you know, the style kind of morphs with whatever's going on with the plot. But with the new one, with Ragmop, The World Needs Laughter, which is the name of the new volume coming from Vault Comics, I wanted people to read it and see the movie. And so it's all done in a very unified cartoon style. And that's exactly what I had in the back of my head, you know, because when I watch, say, Kung Fu Panda, you know, I wanted that same experience for somebody reading Ragmop.
Sure. I guess I should ask about Vault Comics. How did you become involved with Vault? Do you know when the new book is going to come out?
Well, it's slated for spring of 2019,
Uh-huh.
and so I can only cross my fingers and hope that will materialize, because the book was delayed a year, as you know, and that's been very frustrating. So, but they seem very keen for it. They want it. They have high hopes for it. So I was introduced to Vault by John Adams, and John Adams was the designer on the original graphic novel, and I met John because he was a fan. And he wrote me a fan letter, or a fan email at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Had you finished the whole book by then?
yes, I was just in the process of finishing the book, and he asked me to contribute to his book, Truth Serum.
But he'd only read the issues that had come out in the 90s in those 4 years.
That's right. And then it turned out he was a really nice guy. We communicated more. I liked him. I liked his humor a lot. He does cartoons for the New Yorker now. As well as he's designed for, what's that quarterly, Sweeney's? McSweeney's, yes.
Yeah.
He's designed McSweeney's.
That's pretty impressive.
He's a hugely talented designer, and so he ended up designing the graphic novel for me.
And it looks great.
And he did a great job.
So once again, we're talking about the old graphic novel.
Yeah, we're talking about.
He's got no involvement with the new one.
No, he didn't.
He just introduced you to the Vault guys.
Yeah, he just introduced me to the Vault guys. I wanted him to design the new one, but Vault Vault as a publisher, as I have learned, control their brand. They're a new publisher. They're only going into their third year, and they control their brand very, very carefully, and that means taking on all the design of the books. So I have no say in how the book is designed and presented. You know, once my content is done, that's it. I give it to them, and it's whatever comes out. I have to live with it and hopefully like.
Got it.
Yeah.
Do you think they'll actually mess around with the stuff inside the panels?
No.
Special effects or anything?
No. I worked very closely with the colorist, and I was constantly reviewing the colors and making corrections where I felt were needed.
Sure. So from what I understood, at one point in the conversation, they were going to reprint the first volume of Ragmop because I feel like you can't really understand the second volume without having read the first.
Yeah, I tried to make it do the second volume in a way that you could read it and just kind of enjoy it as something nutty. But I understand your point, and yes, they do have my verbal permission to reprint the graphic novel, and I actually gave them all the printer's plates for that, which are just happen to be high res PDFs. So they have everything they need, but there hasn't been any talk to me about reprinting the original, because you would think that they would do that first, and then the next, then week or 2 weeks later do the new one.
It would make more sense because
Yeah.
I think even with the first, you don't spend as much time on character development. What you do is you have the system of pinups that sort of break characters down.
Yeah.
But you're supposed to kind of roll along with the characters. But at least you have that in the first volume. In the second, I felt like I was just really lost at sea because I read that first.
Yes, you are. That's very true. Like I said, it's sink or swim. You just dive right in. I decided not to do any kind of backstory. I just wanted to go full steam ahead on the news story, and hopefully, but at that time I didn't understand that I would have no input on the book. It's on
Right.
how the story was packaged.
Right.
Because in my head I was going to do things in the book that would fill in and introduce the characters. But I never had that conversation.
Such as pinups? Or?
Not such as yes, there were some pinups I could do, but also one of the ideas I wanted to have was to have a page that said previously in Ragmop,
Right.
and then have the entire 400-page graphic
Summarized
novel
on the page.
summarized in little tiny thumbnails, unreadable thumbnails, on one or two pages.
Now, that sounds like your anarchic sense of humor,
Yeah.
but I'm wondering if that anarchic sense of humor is getting in the way of you writing stories that might be more accessible. Because, say, I was reading that,
Yeah.
I would go, I can't understand what's going on, and he's also like rubbing salt in the wound by giving me thumbnails that just for his own pleasure and amusement that I cannot read, even with a magnifying glass.
Yeah, well, I guess that's just the chance I'm going to have to take, and I guess I was also, because there's the possibility that Vault could republish the first graphic novel. I didn't bother with that. But as to where that status is right now, it's all I've got is the one, and so I'll just have to take my chances, and Vault will have to take their chances too, I suppose, and we'll just see what happens.
Let's talk about your characters. Sorry,
Sure.
did you want to say something?
Yeah, just a couple things. In terms of the pinups that appear in the first graphic novel, those are all odes to the pinups that Jack Kirby would do in the Fantastic Four.
Sure.
To my fans, Sue with love. But in the graphic novel, what they actually are my versions of musical numbers. Because you introduce a scene and then you have a dance or a song that gives you exposition on the scene that's just come, and it actually moves the plot along. And so that's why I was using the pinups. I was using the pinups as kind of musical breaks, even though there's no musical numbers on the pinups themselves. They do provide, you meet the characters, they have some interaction, and then you get a pinup page which gives you some exposition to kind of fill out the backstory or the current story as to what's going on.
Sure.
And in terms of...
It's the exposition that I found the most crucial.
Yeah. And then also in terms, just going back to your excellent kind of encapsulation of the ambiance of Ragmop, you have to remember is that the original was produced during the 1990s when there was a giant anti-globalization movement. Nowadays, people would have to reference, Take Back Wall Street. In the 1990s, there was a similar movement, and Ragmop is definitely reflective of that capitalist globalization movement.
Sure, and then there's a shift in those intervening years where there's references to the war on terror and stuff like
Well,
that.
yes, the thing is when I didn't come, it took me so long to finish Ragmop because of 9/11. 9/11 happened and the world changed. Ragmop takes place in the world of George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton. But once 9/11 happened and you've got the Bush Cheney, I thought that I would have to, in order to finish Ragmop, I would have to completely rewrite the whole thing.
There's a number of bad guys, but the ultimate bad guy is Uncle Walt. Is he
Yes.
a Cheney figure?
He's kind of a semi-Cheney figure, yes.
But
Yeah,
not specifically Cheney.
Well, actually, no. Thinking back now, there was one scene. Yes, he is the stand-in for Cheney, because if I go to one of these outtakes that I have at the back
Because
here
the
in
president
Independence.
is sort of like a Dan Quayle
Yes.
type puppet.
Yes. In the 1990s, he actually was Dan Quayle. And then when 9/11 happened and George Bush is president, that was the one thing that I didn't have to touch.
Yeah.
Because George Bush and Dan Quayle were basically the same person.
Sure. Except Quayle was likable.
Yeah, and so I didn't have to do anything. All I had now was a whole new range of quotes, because a lot of the dialogue in the original graphic novel is taken from actual quotes that people have said, that Quayle said, and that George Bush said, and that Dick Cheney has said. And yes, Uncle Walt is the stand-in. I'm looking here at his whole speech on peak oil, and that's all Cheney.
When you use the name Uncle Walt, is that a reference to Walt Disney?
Yes, it is.
Uncle Scrooge and Walt Disney put together?
Well, I think actually Walt Disney was known as Uncle Walt. And because of his fascist backgrounds and his fascist leanings, the name seemed appropriate to appropriate for the character, because it's benign, but as kind of the Bush Cheney
Right.
they present themselves as these kind of benign characters, but underneath, there is something more nefarious.
Right. And you're not enough of an animation fan that you ever stopped to kind of think that was too much of a slight on Walt Disney?
No, not at all.
No.
No, not at all.
No allegiances there. Okay.
No allegiances there. No, it's common knowledge, and even in Bill Pete's autobiography, he's very kind to Walt Disney, but Walt Disney comes off kind of authoritarian, even in Bill Pete's autobiography.
Sure. The second book is sort of more distributed among the characters, but I would say in the first volume, the character that stands out the most is Alice Hawkins.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to talk about her. She's interesting because I can see her genesis in the 90s as a woman that doesn't want to kind of conform to type. She wants all her life to be a nuclear physicist. She's interested in the stars and all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. But people are constantly foisting these feminine ideals on her, and she's very frustrated. Does she shift as time moves on? Because I do feel like her depiction is kind of dated, like stamped with kind of 90s kind of frameworks and concerns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she definitely does grow. She grows in the sense that in the new graphic novel, I tried to be as politically neutral as I could. I didn't want to get into politics or political economy or anything like that. I just wanted a straight ahead adventure in which I could be as funny as I could be under the circumstances. When I said that I needed the laughs, I was really serious. I was in it just for the laughs. And whereas the story that I want to tell after this, the volume 2, which I hope I get a chance to do, will kind of close off the series. And it is that series that you will see kind of the growth of the character as to where she is now in 2019 going into 2020.
If we can just take her back to the 90s, though, why did you pick her as like a central figure? Were you just trying to be politically progressive by...
No, not at all. No, it's the characters of my stories present themselves as male or female, determined on the story. And Ragmop was just a story about a woman who, and I guess this goes back to my childhood or anybody's childhood, where you have dreams for yourself as to what you want to be, but your parents are imposing, and society may be imposing rules on you that you do not want to adopt. And so Alice Hawkins wants to be a physicist. But her parents don't want her to be. Everybody else just basically wants her to be, a housewife. And she's told that she's bad because she's thinking outside the box, and so she decides to adopt the role of a supervillain. And in adopting the role of a supervillain, she inadvertently, of course, becomes a superhero. And I'm not sure how, I don't necessarily see her kind of that kind of feminist story arc as dated right now.
It's more the construction of her, I would say.
Yeah,
even things like when she's a villain, when she's called Thrill Kitten.
Yeah,
it reminds me of things in the '90s. There was like a Kevin Smith movie, I think Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, where there's a depiction of a group of like cat burglars or something, like women cat burglars, and it's kind of similar.
Yeah.
And that joke works at that time.
Yeah.
It doesn't land so well now, not because it's inappropriate, it just seems constructed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, once I had Alice Hawkins, and it is Hawkins with an S. I just misspelled
Stephen
Hawking's name wrong.
I thought it might also be a play on Sadie Hawkins.
No, it wasn't, although that's kind of cute too.
Yeah.
No, I just misspelled.
So where does the
Hawkins
Alice part come from?
Alice is Alice in Wonderland.
Okay, I thought that might be it.
Yeah, Alice is Alice in Wonderland. It's a name I always liked, and but basically, because she goes on
down the
rabbit hole in this. But once I was working with a female protagonist in Ragmop, I decided to comment on the role of women superheroes in the 1990s. And I toned it down. I took a lot of stuff out in the graphic novel that was in the original comics. But some of the stuff you may be referring to maybe...
You mean you've altered some of the stuff that you originally published in the 90s for this? Okay.
Yes.
I was wondering about that because I thought like some of these references are too late for it to have been published in the 90s.
Yeah. I went back and I completely rewrote the whole thing.
Did you redraw stuff?
I did redraw some stuff, but I certainly did a lot of rescripting. Because I had to bring it into the War on Terror.
I see. That makes sense, because I was noticing that.
Yeah, so it had to come from the globalization of the 1990s, the fall of communism, gangster capitalism, and bring that into the War on Terror, which we still had gangster capitalism, but it was a different title.
Sure.
But it was now the United States as opposed to the Russians.
Right.
And just so people know, Mr. Putin. We have Mr. Putin because of American interference in Russia, which created that gangster capitalism, and that left a space for someone like Putin to come up and re-establish order, authoritarian order. So once again, he is the creature of meddling in other countries and losing that control. And so there's a little sidebar on Mr. Putin. Yes, so I had to bring the whole thing forward, and that meant rescripting earlier pages, and that meant redrawing stuff. A new opening. I came up with a brand new opening, and then of course there was the big 75, or I don't know how many pages it took me to conclude the story at the end. And then there's new pages all throughout. I took out one plot line, I added stuff in, I took stuff out.
So you really did fiddle around with it.
I did fiddle around with it too. And the other thing that was really important that made it really possible for me to do this was that I had directed a primetime series at Nelvana prior to doing this. So when I came back to finishing the graphic novel, I treated it like film editing. And I actually, in my head, I thought in film language. I thought, okay, I'm going to need pickups here. I need retakes here. I got to get the cast back together. We have to reshoot this scene. Then we have to shoot this whole new ending. We have to do a whole new beginning. So I'm going to need you. I'm going to need you. I'm going to need you. Are you available? Yes, come on down. I got to draw you today. This is the way I was talking to myself. And also, I got rid of all the tangents. And I streamlined the whole story, and I really imposed discipline on the story itself. I shouldn't flip through this because it'll distract me as to what I'm saying. So I imposed a very kind of strict storyline. And the other thing I did is I got scenes down. In film, you don't want scenes to last longer than 3 minutes. And so the graphic novel kind of...
Film or animation or both?
Film. Animation, I don't know. I never thought about it. But in film, generally, you want to work in 3-minute scenes. Just very generally speaking. And so in the graphic novel, because it's so dense as well, I work in 3 to 5 page kind of scenes as well. And so that gives you bookmarks where you can stop reading. You don't have to read 30 pages.
The only thing I would say is they're too rapid because it's hard, especially as you flip back and forth between your various subplots. It's hard. It's hard. So I found myself putting it down, coming back to it, putting it down, coming back to it. And it's too much of a staccato rhythm for me. But anyway, go on. But
that's not necessarily bad.
No, it
because it is very frantic, and that could be the Bob Clampett influence in it, because his cartoons are all incredibly manic. Although they only last for 7 minutes as opposed to...
And I also thought of It's a Mad, Mad, Mad World, which you reference on the cover.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
It is that kind of a comedy.
Sure.
It is kind of that kind of epic scale comedy where the stakes just getting bigger and bigger and bigger as you go along.
And you add characters all the time, so you never really kind of... get familiar with a character because you're constantly reeling to... And some of the characters, like the Terminator Bunny in the mental hospital...
Harv, yeah.
I have to say, I get it's from the movie Harvey, and I get it's from, Terminator 2, but it's just like...
Well, it's also Sin City, Marv.
Oh, it's Marv.
Yeah.
It's just there's too many, I found. And it's funny because... nowadays the pacing of things is so much faster and so much more stimulated than it used to be before. But yet I find reading your first volume, I think you slowed down more in your second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the third one was going to be even slower still.
Which would be kind of still even just about normal for me.
Yes, and I don't know what kind of humor is going to be in the third one.
Yeah.
Because I'm not thinking funny for it right now. I'm just thinking what I want to do is an actual proper literate story.
Yeah.
Using one of the 7 primary plots.
Sure.
And because I want to wrap things up and I want to get a little bit more serious and do some proper character development. The problem with Ragmop is that I'm doing it by myself. I only have a certain amount of time in which to get things done. I don't have the luxury of building a storyline over 2 or 3 years. Whether at Image or at Marvel or at DC, and really kind of developing characters that way. I just kind of have to go with it and get in there and get it done and tell the story. And just making the best out of the situation that I have in which to work. I did the initial Ragmop I did over the course of about 4 years, say. And then I had basically a year to pull it all together at the end to make the graphic novel.
Not a lot of time.
Yeah, and so
maybe that compression has kind of worked its way into the rhythm as well.
Yeah, so you could be reading that now. I don't have the same problems that you do, and that's fine. And other readers have not expressed that to me.
No, because you've only gotten a lot of praise from what I can tell.
Yeah, so. It may not be for everybody, and that's fine. I mean, it's art. It's a particular kind of art, And I take no offense if someone reads it and doesn't get it, or it does nothing for them, or they don't find it funny, or they stop reading on page 4. That's fine.
I wouldn't say any of those things. I would just say that the rhythm is hard for me.
Yeah.
It's too bouncy. It's too cartoony.
Yeah, well...
But we talked about this before, and you said you would only take that as a compliment.
Yes. And as an animator, as a cartoonist coming out of the where my influences are not only like Bob Clampett and Chuck Jones and the Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy and Harold Lloyd was also very important to me.
Great, yeah.
For Ragmop, but also you got to do Mort Drucker and Spy versus Spy and Jack Davis. Jack Davis next to Bob Clampett is probably the second most primary influence on me. Bill Elder. I'm coming out of that kind of that 1960s Mad Magazine milieu as well, which was extremely anarchistic.
Sure.
And also because I have an encyclopedic recall of pop culture, I just absorbed it like a sponge as a kid. It just naturally fumigated the book, if I can use that term.
No, that's a good term for it. Fumigated.
So it is filled with that. So why don't we read what the characters have to say?
Yeah, let's go back to that.
Let's go back to what the characters have to say.
Coming up, what the characters have to say. Rob's love of old Marvel comics and how he fused those stories onto modern ideas in his own work, the development of his politics, his management style, and more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show. We really appreciate your support.
You like cheap comic books, right? Well, I'm Professor Allen, and I talk about cheap comic books on the Quarterbin Podcast. In every episode, I'll dissect a single comic from my collection, as long as I paid no more than 25 cents for the issue. Forget about $4 new comics that you can read in 4 minutes, or crossover events that can cost $100 to collect. Join me in the Quarterbin, where even bad comics are a bargain, and good ones are a steal. The Quarterbin Podcast is part of the Relatively Geeky Podcast Network. Visit us at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search Relatively Geeky or Quarterbin Podcast in iTunes. I guarantee it'll be worth every penny.
Oh, and this is good too. This is Einstein the dinosaur. And his brain is popping out of his head, and his eyes are bulging out of his head as well as he's saying this. And he's saying, Ragmop is a retro Silver Age infused action comedy sci-fi extravaganza that will blow your pop culture minds, in which I also get hurt a lot.
That's great.
But that's another interesting aspect is that I was a Marvel kid.
Uh-huh.
I loved Silver Age DC, but by the 70s I was primarily a Marvel kid.
You obviously loved Devil Dinosaur.
Oh yes, well I loved all Jack Kirby and yes, and Devil Dinosaur for the second volume was that was icing on the cake for me. But Ragmop is also my love letter to Marvel Comics in the 1960s. You can read it, and it is constructed as a Marvel comic, as the way Marvel Comics used to be in the 1960s. It's actually in there. And not only do I rip off a lot of pages from Fantastic Four and Captain America are in there, in which I recontextualize them to our modern war on terror and feminist feminist context. I'm really most proud of Alice's origin in there, in which I reworked the origin of the Red Skull into a feminist retelling of Alice's ultimate origin as Thrill Kitten.
I kind of liked your Dr. Doomsayer who was kind of like a reference to, but he was sort of like a Banana Republic.
Yeah,
dictator.
exactly. That's
Yeah, yeah,
and the subversive mariner, yes.
Yeah, the subversive mariner.
who was basically Che Guevara.
Right.
So, and the Covert Quartet, which was all the, also, I mean, Ragmop is also laden with conspiracy.
Yeah.
Which I grew up with, starting with the Kennedys, both, well, the 1960s, I had to live through the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, and Malcolm X.
Right.
And then you had various shootings in the 1970s, kind of culminating with the Reagan assassination attempt. And that's a whole other discussion on itself.
But you're not really a conspiracy theorist. You're kind of a political...
Well, yeah, but it's underlining in there. And yes, I do, just so people know, I do read conspiracies as history. And I'm interested in their historical context and that. And I do take conspiracies seriously, but I'm coming from a different age. As to what conspiracy is to me will be very different to what conspiracy is to, say, someone who's 20 or 30 years old in 2019, where it's convoluted with fake news and other things.
Sure.
So it is a very different thing.
Well, even the idea of fake news is sort of a conspiracy. It's part of the regime of Trump, which we always had fake news, but just the way he deploys that term is an odd kind of strategy. Yeah,
and you can't see it as one-sided, and I don't want to get into it too deep because, like I say, it's in a whole other 2-hour conversation by itself.
Although we should at some point talk about your politics, because I think that's central to the first volume.
Yes.
And it might be interesting to look at how the first and the second volume link in terms of your politics and what you want to do with your art.
Yeah, so let's see what General False Flag has to say. So General False Flag is the antagonist in the new graphic novel, The World Needs Laughter.
Should we say anything about him being an alien or not?
Well, you just said it, so. Well, you know what?
Nothing more.
Well, no, yeah.
That's revealed pretty early on in the second volume.
That's right. I don't, because it's all set up in the first volume, I don't try to hide anything in the second volume. I just get right to it on page 8.
Sure. And
so,
I kept meaning to ask, and I'll forget if I don't ask now, but did you have any hand in the Dinos TV show? Because your Dino characters remind me.
No.
Do you remember that show where they were like live action, like people wearing costumes as dinosaurs? It was sort of like the Flintstones, but it was a 90s sitcom.
Yes, I remember that sitcom. They parodied it on The Simpsons.
Yeah. So you had nothing to do with
that.
No,
I had nothing to do with that.
Okay.
No, sadly, no. So let's see what General False does. So this is Ragmop from the villain's point of view.
Uh-huh.
And I really like, I really enjoy, we can talk about this in politics, when you talk about politics, but it's on my mind now, so I'll just mention in that when I did my bibliography, I read both sides. I read Kissinger, I read von Hayek, as well as reading Carter and Parente and Chomsky. So I was reading from both sides because I wanted to give equal representation. Now, in the original graphic novel, I don't give equal representation. That balance is coming in the later stuff. But this is so this is from the villain's point of view. How would I describe Ragmop? From a villain's point of view, it's about conspiracy. Well, there you go. That's what we Draco represent. The Draco are the aliens. All the conflicting doomsday scenarios that divide and enslave our minds through fear from living more authentic and cooperative human lives. It's about a love and respect for both life and life's place in the universe. We hate that. So that's what they're fighting against. So they're about authoritarian control of both mind and body, which humans have suffered through constantly throughout human history. And we are seeing that now from both sides. Both right and left are in a war over the human mind right now. And we've never, I don't ever recall it being this pronounced on both sides.
Yeah,
where
it feels like it's a really miserable time.
They are at war. I don't trust CNN any more than I trust Trump. So this is what Alice has to say. This is what our hero has to say.
That's Alice?
That's Alice, yeah.
How come her hair's not blonde and how come it's...
Well, because for these cartoons that I was posting on Twitter, I decided to change things up, and I just decided to give her a blue rinse.
Cool.
Yeah, so in this cartoon, just so to give you the visual, she's dressed in a very 60s pop T-shirt, which is a yellow and red stripe. And her
kind of looks a little bit like Midge from the Archie comics.
Yeah, and her hair is blue. And she has very bright fuchsia lipstick on and blue eyeshadow. So for the second volume, I modeled her after Twiggy. In the first volume, she's actually modeled after Barbara Stanwyck and as well as Bugs Bunny.
Sure.
But I was thinking Twiggy in the second volume. So she's saying, what, my turn? Okay, pressure's on. Let's see, Ragmop. Firstly, it has a strong female lead, obviously. It has a judicious mix of male-female human-animal characters who are an equal representation of good and bad. And the stories are told with the same gleeful anarchy as a Warner Brothers cartoon, which we've already touched on. And I think that's, in the second volume, one of the differences, just commenting on what Alice just had to say there, is in the first volume, I really was against the villains. I didn't have a lot of sympathy for them. And even though I was trying to give them equal representation, it's pretty obvious where my loyalties are with Alice. But in the second volume, I feel as if I was more neutral. I just told the story and let the story dictate. I wasn't making commentary really on the villains the way I was here. And there's two main villains in the new volume. There's General False Flag, who represents the aliens, the Draco, who are trying to take over humanity. And then there's the corporate villain, the Duck. Vermilion Vanderbilt. Yes, Vermilion Vanderbilt.
It kind of looks a little bit like...
Vanderbilt.
Okay, is that a character from the Donald Duck line?
No.
From Darkwing Duck?
No, I went to the actual source. The
You mean Cornelius Vanderbilt?
Yes, there he is, right there.
Oh, okay.
So,
but the way you've drawn him looks like one of those famous. Oh,
yes. Well, he does look. He is drawn kind of in that Disney style.
Yeah.
Howard the Duck early style. So he is very Disney, but he's got those, I don't know what you call those sideburns that...
They're massive, yeah.
Yeah, that just kind of flow out like...
Why would anybody have ever done that is what I'm wondering.
Well,
like even in history, why would anybody grow their sideburns down to their nipples, almost? So
for your viewers, let's just say that they're outrageous.
Yeah.
It's like a beard, only you've shaved in your chin.
But it's much bigger than a beard. It extends down to his bow tie.
Yes, it goes right down to the collar.
Yeah.
Beyond. But the same haircut. The duck has the same haircut and everywhere. Right. So that's there's the kind of the historical model.
Gotcha. But if I can ask a couple of questions, one, where are your politics at? If you don't trust either the right or the left. Where are your politics now? And my second question is also, why are you so totally consumed with American politics when you've lived in Toronto all your life?
Well, to start with
when you're Canadian.
To start with the second one first, is that American politics just kind of dominates the news
and the world
and the world.
Yeah.
When Jack Kennedy is shot, I mean, that was it for Saturday morning television. Cartoons were canceled because they're having the funeral.
Yeah.
So this, so it was just in my consciousness, and and watching Saturday morning cartoons, it's ABC, NBC, CBS. There's no CBC or CTV or Channel 11. Well, maybe CTV. CTV was Channel 9, and I forget what CHCH. I think it was Channel 11, if memory serves me correctly. There was after-school programming on those, but for Saturday morning, you went to the American stations.
Sure.
It was all coming out of Buffalo. here in Toronto. So and movies, it's just overpowering, just the American influence, and particularly in the 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assassinations of presidents and presidential candidates, and the Black Panthers, and the whole social civil rights movement is the word I'm looking for, and Vietnam. It was inescapable. And so, and Canadian politics at the time was so quiet. I mean, it was there, but it was all kind of behind the scenes with Pearson. Well, I was too young for Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker was with Eisenhower in the 1950s, and then Pearson in the 60s. And
what about Trudeau?
Well, that's the thing. I'm just getting to Trudeau, but things really didn't kind of take off until Trudeau mania in 68.
And then the FLQ tensions.
Yes, and then the FLQ tensions, and then I became, it was right there. It was one province over, like 5 hours down the highway. They have martial law. And that was huge. And then things became much more kind of politically aware in Toronto and Ontario as you move into the 1980s, and you have all the Aboriginal movements, the Indigenous peoples, the uprisings in Quebec and Ontario, and then you have Mike Harris coming in Ontario, and people don't remember what an iron fist and an iron boot that man brought down on this province with the amalgamation of Toronto.
I remember, sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, none of that was like inspiring you to want to write comics about that?
Well,
I always felt like Sims comics, even though they didn't touch it on the head, were sort of Canadian in terms of their politics. Whereas yours are very American. Yeah, they're
very American, and I haven't got into the Canadiana of the characters themselves, because I consider Alice Hawkins Canadian. So she's Canadian. Till is American. He's based on Richard Feynman, the American physicist. And just to give you a quick origin, the origin of the series came from the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger. And the idea that this little tiny O-ring could pop and cause the entire mission to go, well, I don't want to say go up in flames, but to cause that tragedy to happen where the shuttle just exploded and killed everybody on board. And it was Richard Feynman who demonstrated how the O-ring caused the disaster by dropping it into a glass of ice water, and the thing just went pop, with the cold. And so my initial idea coming from that was, again, how man tries to control nature and the hubris of thinking that, we can just build a machine and fly to the stars, and it's all just going to be
That's very Kubrickian.
Smooth sailing, where we can be undone by this simple little thing that everybody has. Everybody has an O-ring. You tighten it on the hose. You tighten, it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous within a little piece of technology, and there it was.
That's a very profound origin story.
Yeah.
But anyway.
But in terms of my personal. So she's and then I brought in the Italian character in the new one, and the dinosaurs, and the animal characters in it are all kind of neutral. They can just kind of there's kind of a neutrality to them. And then with the third one becomes very kind of internationally flavored. But as to my personal politics, I grew up. My dad was New Democratic, which is our Democratic Social party here in Canada, in case anybody in the US is listening. And so I grew up kind of in an NDP household. And so I always voted NDP. And being an artist and being right-brained or left-brained, I can't remember.
Right-brained.
Right-brained. I had... And I've learned, Jordan Peterson actually talks a lot about this. But in terms of neurology, I have a natural leaning towards issues of social justice. And social justice for me, again, growing up in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s, is completely different to what social justice has become in terms of identity politics and things like that. Completely different.
I agree with you. I miss the old days.
Yeah.
Even just coming of age in the 90s,
Yeah.
I feel like so uncomfortable with where things are at now. And not just social justice, but the way it plays out in social media and electronically and in a millennial flavored world.
Yes, yeah, it's very touchy, and you have to approach that with as much caution as any other subject in 2019.
Sure.
And so I you know, in the 1970s and the 1980s, coming out of the Vietnam War, there's a thing called just a bit of history for your listeners, there was the dirty wars in Central and South America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Chile, Argentina were the main hotspots. And
of course Afghanistan too.
At that time, the Afghanistan war was going on in the Middle East at that time with the Russians. And we know now that for historical certainty that the Americans suckered the Russians into invading Afghanistan. So when the Americans were stupid enough to go there themselves after 9/11, all I could think of, having witnessed the first time around, is the Russians just must have been killing themselves laughing.
And of course Iraq too.
Yeah.
They really
yeah.
bolstered their weapon arsenal.
Yes. So when I came to do Ragmop, yes, it was reflective of a left-wing politics.
Yes, and that's clear.
It's very, very clear.
Yeah, you were.
And I'm still comfortable with that. I don't regret that at all. I have no problems with that.
And it's a very dialectical book in that sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is a very dialectical book in that sense, and I just wanted to deal with some things because both the left and the right, I think where I have an advantage, just trying to step back and be neutral, is that I'm also have a natural sensitivity to and however this developed, I have a natural sensitivity to hypocrisy, and I recognize it very quickly. So when the left says one thing and does another, I'm there. I'm on them. When the right says one thing and does another, I'm on them.
But how can you be neutral? How can you just pull back feelings that you've had?
Well, because I have to again go back to the source of what my feelings are. And I was very influenced. Part of my influence was the Gospels, reading the Gospels as a teenager. And again, going into my 20s and studying at university the Hebrew Bible.
What did you study? Did you go to OCAM?
I went to York University, and I was primarily studying doing religious studies.
Which you're being an artist at that time, or an animator?
Well, no. That's getting into my sad story. I desperately wanted to be a Disney animator, but my parents weren't going to have that. And this is where we get into Alice's story a bit, her backstory, I suppose. My mother was determined that I was going to be a dentist.
But you ended up in religious studies.
Yes, and so I thought, well, I wanted to be an actor. My parents didn't want that. No, they wanted me to be a dentist. So what happens was I just ended up having a complete breakdown and not even graduating high school. So I went to university when I was 21 as a mature student.
Gotcha.
And
at that point, you could take whatever you want.
Yeah, and at that point, take whatever I want. And my interest in religion was growing. I should say Anglicanism. I was with the Anglican Church, which is a Protestant branch of Christianity, kind of one removed from Catholicism. And within Anglicanism themselves, there's a very low Anglicanism, which is very close to almost evangelical. And then there's a very high Anglicanism, which is very close to Catholicism, where you're actually doing the incense and the chanting and the plain song and things like that. So I was actually very interested in becoming ordained. Again, because there was a sense of social justice. And the Anglican Church at that time was a force for social justice, so much so that they were on the naughty list of the Canadian CSIS as an agitator. And I saw that as a badge of courage. The Jesuits were agitators, and the Anglican Church were seen as agitators, which meant they were fighting for human rights. That's all that meant. And when you fight for human rights, you're butting your head up against generally capitalist concerns. And so within a capitalist economy, that's not good. So I was thinking of becoming ordained, and I had a great interest in the Bible, and studying it at university just brought it to a whole new kind of historical ancient literature level, which we've talked about. Because when people hear me say religious studies, that will have, without explaining what it means to me, it'll just be up to whatever their conception of religion is. Oh, he was studying religion. It's like God. When people go on talking about God, the first thing you have to do is determine, well, what do you mean by God? What do you believe in that you don't believe in? Whether it's the man with the white beard who wags his finger at everybody or whatever. Whereas religious studies is a scientifically based, multi-discipline study that involves archaeology, history, ancient literature, ancient languages, literature, it's politics, economics. It encompasses everything, which is just, I find incredibly fascinating that one document could encompass so much. Because it's not simply about people believing in a God and coming up with rules. It's about the history of a people and why they believe in a God and came up with rules. And coming up with rules isn't necessarily bad. You're dealing with an ancient society, and they need to establish rules. I mean, and it's the same thing with Gilgamesh. I was thinking about Gilgamesh the other day, this great king, but he was out of control. And the people could pray to the gods, will you please get this guy under control here? We need some rules here by which he can operate. And so much of ancient literature is about that, is about human conduct. Good conduct versus bad conduct, creative conduct versus destructive conduct. And so that's a lot where my interest in being ordained lie. I saw myself working with the poor, working, for the homeless, the hungry, all of those things. Just within the context of the Anglican Church. And that comes into the Ragmop as well.
So how did you go from there to being an animator or a cartoonist?
Well, I got to my master's degree, and I realized that getting ordained was completely wrong for me. It wasn't going to work, and it was going to be detrimental to both myself and any potential congregation that might have hired me at the time. So I drifted around for several years. I worked some odd jobs. And then I just kind of fell into animation completely by accident. It was one of those situations that no longer happens where you bump into a guy. I bump into Doug Toms at the corner of Bloor and Danforth. And he says, "Oh, Rob, they're hiring at Nelvana. They're starting up Beetlejuice, and they're doing 52 episodes, and they're hiring."
And this was after you dropped out of your master's?
This is after I dropped out of my master's.
Like soon after?
No, this is almost 4 years after.
So you must have been keeping your drawing up.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, because I was working, one of the jobs I took, I worked at the Silver Snail, and while I'm working at the Silver Snail, Dark Knight comes out.
You did the Pork Night,
and then
which I have a copy of somewhere.
Yes, and so I did Pork Night.
Yeah.
And how Pork Night happened was I was just putting up cartoons on the wall, and the owner of the store saw them, and this is right in the middle of the first black and white explosion, where anybody with $10 who could pay a printer would pay a printer and have their comic published. So Ron Van Leeuwen saw my comics that I posted on the wall, thought it was funny, called me into his office one day. I think I'm getting fired. And he says, "So, Rob, how'd you like to do a comic for us?" And sure. And so we did Pork Night. And so that's how I got into comics. And then I did Bloodlines at Aircell and a couple other things. And Matt Wagner really liked Bloodlines. And that's where I got the invitation to do Grendel Tales. Grendel Tales was put on hiatus, so they gave me the Predator to draw as compensation. So that's how I ended up doing Predator. And then Grendel Tales happened. And then,
so when did you do Predator? Because I bought some of the earliest issues in the 80s.
I only did an 8-page story.
Chris Warner, okay.
Yeah, Chris Warner cover on it. It was Dark Horse Presents, I guess.
I see.
And it was an 8-page story. And
do you still have some of that art kicking around?
Yes, I do.
I'd love to see it.
Yeah. I will go into my portfolio if we have just a couple minutes after the interview and have a quick look. And so one thing, and so I did Grendel Tales, and I thought Grendel Tales would be my breakthrough piece, but it didn't. It just got out there and didn't, and there was like no response to it, which really kind of shocked me a lot.
Because Grendel was big back then.
Yeah,
I never read it myself, but I've never seen it.
And because other people like Steve Siegel and that were, they did it and then they quickly moved on, and there was a natural progression there. And that's when I ended up doing Ragmop, because it was the only thing available to me.
Because nobody was hiring you? And
yeah,
so
because
I got to do my own
comic. Nobody was hiring me. I actually pitched Ragmop, a version of Ragmop, my proto version of Ragmop. I pitched to Vertigo before I realized that Vertigo had no sense of humor. It was strictly going to be like a horror type thing.
Oh, I remember that story. I don't know if you want to tell it. But I think that's a great story about how you dropped into her office.
No, I don't want to tell that story because because it's bad karma, and I really don't understand how that happened and the dynamics of it.
Fair enough. When you decided to create Ragmop, were you aware of the second boom was happening in the 90s after Bone and
Yes. Oh yes, I was jumping on the coattails there.
Okay.
Yeah, I was definitely crossing my fingers, but it wasn't just me too, because it was the same with Veitch and Toddlebin. Not Toddlebin, sorry, Veitch and Bissett.
Yeah.
And Xander Cannon. I mean, we all saw the success of Bone and thought, well, maybe we can get a piece of this.
And it was also I don't know whatever happened.
And so that made it possible to publish. Yeah.
So I don't know. You've had a really interesting trajectory. I guess, where do you find yourself now? Are you happy with the animation
Well, I mean, the animation paid for Ragmop.
And you're not even really drawing anymore. You're overseeing projects, right?
No, I'm still a storyboard artist. I've been strictly a storyboard artist now for a long time.
I see.
Yeah. I directed in 2000, 2001, and then I turned down 2 subsequent directing jobs for reasons I don't want to go into, because it's done. It's the decision was made. So and I went back to storyboarding, and so I've been storyboarding ever since, and the directing, which is what I really enjoyed. But directing at that level, at a corporate level, it's the creativity was going out of the position. And luckily, I learned a hell of a lot as an assistant director and then as a supervising director. So I'm really happy to have that experience.
And what's amazing is you didn't go to OCAD or somewhere else.
No,
you're totally self-taught.
Yes,
I'm guessing.
Yes, I'm totally self-taught, and I learned animation completely on the job.
That's incredible.
And I'm a very fast learner. And the one thing that I learned, and I credit the coach of the Edmonton Oilers, Hugh Campbell, who won 5 straight Grey Cups with the Edmonton Oilers. He said, somebody said, well, you're...
And Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah, he said, someone asked him, well, you must be the greatest coach ever. And he says, no. The secret to my success is letting other people do their jobs. And so that stuck with me to the point where when I was in animation, I started to see how it was departmentalized and how each department worked. And so when I got into assistant directing, I had strong, I could get into directing. I started off in design, doing location designs. And then I moved into storyboarding because I had the storytelling skills. And they developed me in-house, which was very nice. They took a group of us and developed us as the new generation of board artists. And from storyboarding, there's a natural step to directing. And so I had all the storytelling skills I needed. And I realized that directing was just about storytelling, and every aspect of production is about storytelling. So the way you color it is about telling a story. The way you edit it is about telling a story. The way you write it is about telling. So every department, the way you design it is about telling the story. Are you telling the story? If that guy's wearing corduroy pants, is that telling the story you want to tell, or should he be wearing jeans or wool or something? And so when I got to directing, I made it all about storytelling, and I also respected all the different department heads. And like Hugh Campbell, I let them do their jobs. And everybody loved working with me as a result, because I didn't come in there and impose my vision on them. I said, a good example is one of the best things I did was I came into an editing suite, and there was 1 minute that had to be taken out. And the editor looked at me and says, well, what do you want to do, Rob? And I looked at my watch and I said, well, you know what? It's 10 to 12. I'm going to go grab a sandwich. I'm hungry. I'm going to get something to eat. You take out 1 minute. Just take out whatever you want. Use your discretion. I'll come back. I'll watch it. If I don't see anything wrong, well, we're done. If I do see something, if I do notice something, we'll talk about it. And her eyes just lit up. It was the most wonderful thing to see. I went out, I grabbed a sandwich, got some food in my stomach. I came back, I watched it. It was great. I don't even remember. I may have had maybe one or two things to say, but other than that, I let the editor do their job, and their job is to edit. And
now you're storyboarding, so you're not doing individual cells, but you're working by yourself.
I'm working by myself now, but storyboarding is just. It's almost directing.
Are you working at home?
Yes, I work at home. I have my software right here on the computer. So as a board artist, I'm the director of the actors. I'm also the cinematographer. I'm also the location scout and designer. I do a lot of jobs. It's not simply just translating the story from a written page to a visual blueprint. And anymore. There's a lot more responsibilities there. And my theater experiences served me very well in terms of acting and staging, and designing scenes that are clear. And so it's very easily to establish who is where within a set.
Do you find that being able to be an animator, and at least at one time having had to generate a fair number of drawings, makes it easier to be a cartoonist or a comic book illustrator?
My God. You know what?
Not just in terms of capability, but in terms of the work amount.
Yeah, well, because I did this. When I finished The World Needs Laughter, I actually I did a rough count of the number of panels that I wrote, drew, and inked in that graphic novel, and I produced that graphic novel in 5 months. Working a page, 2 pages a day, and then revising and stuff like that. Basically, I had 5 months to get it done, and so I got the whole thing done in 5 months, 158 pages. And I counted the panels, and then I opened a random storyboard. And I counted the panels in the random storyboard. And there are more panels in a storyboard than in a 158 page graphic novel, which means...
A storyboard for something 2 hours long?
No, 11 minutes.
Wow.
11 minutes. There are more panels to draw in an 11-minute storyboard than in that entire graphic novel, which means... I am doing in 4 weeks the amount of drawing, a greater amount of drawing than I did in 5 months. And I have to do that month after month. And so no wonder it's such an exhausting job, because it's a rewarding job. It's a great job compared to what's out there. but it's an exhausting job, and you have no life, and that was a great way for me to gain a greater appreciation for the amount of work that it takes to produce a storyboard in a 4-week period, as opposed to a graphic novel that took me 5 months to do.
But you wouldn't then say, I know this is false logic, but you wouldn't then say, let me just like work on my own stuff, pump out as much as I can.
Well, yes, I would love to do that.
If
Yeah.
people were buying it.
Yeah, if people, yes.
But I met people who just promote their own stuff, who just go to convention after convention, rent a table, sell their own stuff, and seem to sort of make a living.
Yeah, I mean, but I have my daughter and
Fair
things
enough.
like that
Fair
in
enough.
university, and I got into the family responsibility thing. And if I was just single, then yes, I could downsize a great deal and just maybe concentrate, go live in somebody's flat or something, rent a flat or something at much cheaper, and live more spartanly or frugally, and do what Dan Clowes did for so many years, because that was Dan Clowes' thing. He lived extremely cheaply, so he could produce his comics, Lloyd Llewellyn and all that early run of comics that he did.
I'm guessing his wife probably worked too.
Well, I don't think he was married at that time. I seem to remember him saying that he was living in his grandmother's attic or something like that. But he lived in a way that allowed him to produce comics and only comics.
Sure.
Whereas I got myself into a cycle where I always had to choose between animation and comics, or do comics in the breaks in which I wasn't doing animation. And I would love to go back and just do the comics. I really want to do the last story I have for Ragmop is going to be another probably 300 pages at least.
Oh, really? The third one.
The third one.
That's going to be
And
a spell.
And well, yeah, but having done the first one, which is 400 pages, doing a 160-page graphic novel,
keep in mind,
it's a
this
piece
was
of cake.
Done in 2 stints. The first one was 4 years, and the second one was I don't know how many.
Well, 5 months, yeah.
So you're still looking at 5 years.
No, not at all. No.
Not for your 300 pages.
No, drawing digitally, because I did the second one completely digitally, and that just speeds up the work. Yeah, well, drawing on paper, I could do a page and a half a day. I could pencil, I could letter, pencil, and ink a page, and then pencil and letter a page. And then in the morning, I would ink that page, and then pencil, ink, and letter the next page. And that cycle would continue. So basically a page and a half a day. Whereas digitally, I could do up to 4 pages a day, depending on what was going on.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's just so much faster and easier, because you're practically drawing with your ink brush, and you're cutting out. You got some rough kind of pencils, but you're pretty much. I was pretty much drawing straight with my ink brush for a lot of panels, because I just want things to be really loose and gestural in the new one.
Gotcha. Well, that's a good place to stop. Is there anything else you'd like to add about what you're doing, or
about what I'm doing? Yeah. I mean, just to go back, I'm looking at the back of the graphic novel here, and there's there's a couple of quotes which are helpful in going back to your original synopsis of it. And the first one's from the Staros Report, and the Staros Report was an independent comic put out by Chris Staros in the 1990s. In which he featured various comic people and also reviewed stuff as well. It was kind of like a comic book anthology with fanzine material in it. And he wrote here, Rob Walton is as insightful as he is dead-on funny, and his frolicking adventure, which parodies mankind itself, leaves nothing sacred except for one's own imagination. And because the comic became known as the comic about everything. And certainly the first volume is kind of reflective of that.
Yeah, and we should also ask, if people wanted to get a hold of the first volume, do you have a website that they can order the copy on?
No,
What about Facebook? Then maybe they could contact.
Yeah, they can contact me through Facebook,
Sure.
and they could always pay me through PayPal. The only problem is, and the only caveat is I sell the book fairly inexpensively, but mailing it in Canada is stupidly expensive.
Canada Post has become insanely expensive.
Yes, so you may...
Not prohibitively, you can still buy it, but I mean, I'm just saying compared to the U.S.
Yeah, so within Canada, let's say, within Canada, if I charge you $15 for the book, the cost of mailing it will be almost $15.
Yeah. But it's still a good deal.
Yeah. So I try to give them away cheaply to make it affordable.
Sure.
When you add the mail cost on top of it.
I hear you.
Yeah. And then the other quote I just wanted to read was from Slings and Arrows Comic Guide, again, which is an independent comic guide that came out in the early 2000s. And surprisingly enough, I'm in it. And the guy that edited this, Frank Plowright, is also was an editor on 1001 Comics to Read Before You Die, and he was responsible for Ragmop.
Is that Paul Gravett's book?
Yes, Paul Gravett's book, and he was responsible for Ragmop being included in 1001 Comics to Read Before You Die. So it is. So if you're only going to do one graphic novel, make sure it's one of the 1001 essential graphic novels. So his quote was, "A sly, snide, perceptive, exciting, gut-bustingly funny, and utterly indescribable. Ragmop is a work of frenetic brilliance." Well, you can, that's subjective, obviously, but the fact that it's utterly indescribable, I mean, that's just something that you're going to have to deal with
Sure.
It just seems to be a byproduct of the way my mind works.
Sure.
On the first volume, at least. And I tried to make the second volume more describable.
Sure.
Check the show notes for a link to Rob's Facebook page. Here at deconstructingcomics.com, we produce Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Poles. If you like our shows and want to support them, pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. On Patreon, this week we'll release the second episode of Spider-Man 1963, a bi-weekly issue-by-issue look at the first year of everyone's favorite wall crawler. It's available to patrons giving at the $5 level or higher. Patrons get a special feed address that works with most podcast apps for easy access to the patrons-only content. Join the fun by backing us for $5 a month or more at patreon.com/deconcomics. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. We'd really appreciate it if you gave us a star rating there and a short review. Even if it's just a sentence, tell the world why you enjoy Deconstructing Comics. Another way to show your appreciation is simply to write to us. Email us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com and on comicon.com, where our new episodes usually go up a few days before they appear in our feed. Our theme is from bensound.com. Last Thursday on To the Bat Poles, Paul and I discussed The Og and I. It's the final Egghead and Olga episode, but it was originally meant to be the first. And then next week we'll be talking about the script for the original three-parter. Listen to the Bat Poles in its own podcast feed on Apple Podcasts or other podcast apps, or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next Wednesday, Mulele and I will be here to discuss more comics we picked up at Tokyo's comics shows last November. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.